And we realized that the animal health market is an opportunity to enter a field that has limited competition, where there are more surgeries done in pets every year than there are in humans. And so this is a massive market, but a market that's underserved.
All right, Julie Wolf, welcome to the Grow Everything podcast. You're my co-host today. Erum is on the road, and you've been on the podcast before. You're a seasoned podcast host and guest. So I'm super excited to have you here today. What's going on in your world, Julie?
Thanks, Karl. I'm so glad to be back. I love sitting on this side of the microphone as well. It's always very different when you're the one who's being interviewed. But things are going great. It is April. We are just closing our Q1. We've had a very busy, made a number of investments at 2048 Ventures. And I just arrived back from the UK. I took a trip last week to meet our portfolio companies. We've been very bullish on some of the amazing technologies coming out of that ecosystem. And we now have 4 companies that we were able to get together, do a portfolio event. I went to some of their lab spaces to see how the magic is being done, and also met a number of entrepreneurial professors, students, investors. It's a really thriving ecosystem, and I'm glad to have had the opportunity to spend some time there IRL, given that so many of our meetings are, like many, using Zoom.
We've always known, I think, that the UK has a tremendous ecosystem, but what is it that has attracted 2048 to going over there and making investments? I think something people don't realize is that the UK is just as far as California for us in New York, so it's really not that far. It could be a very attractive place to do investments, but what's the motivation for 2048?
I think that we were first introduced to the UK with our first investment, which was Coding Bio. Through them, we met a number of investors and just got to know the ecosystem a little more closely. The science being done there is amazing. A lot of folks who are thinking about this tech bio world as well, like the platforms that can be used for discovery of different types of products, which is very much aligned with our investment thesis. And so it helps when folks have the business model as well as the technology mindset that is aligned with a firm, just in order to move forward. So lots of really great stuff. They have amazing research going on in cell and gene therapy. There are some super materials companies, and just really great ecosystem.
Is there anyone besides Coding Bio that you could talk about that's in the portfolio or that you want to highlight?
I actually went specifically for a meeting with Therapeutics. This is a SynBio play. They have a synthetic microbe that can do stromal remodeling. And what is the stroma? But it's the extracellular matrix around the tumor. And this extracellular matrix around the tumor actually prevents a lot of current therapies like checkpoint inhibitors, CAR-Ts, ADCs from reaching the tumor cells. So the idea is that Niobe can apply their microbe. It will eat away or destroy some of that tissue, the tumor extracellular matrix, and then allow those therapies to have their action. So really cool technology, very wonderful CEO, CSO with super backgrounds. And so that was the company that I went over specifically to meet. I had never met Pedro or Annalise in person, but it was really wonderful to spend some time with them.
That's tremendous, because I think probably most people don't realize that cancer therapeutics are changing. They're becoming way more precise and targeting very specific cells. But if you can't get them into the cell because of the stroma, you can't deliver your cancer cell killing payload unless you can make it through this extracellular matrix that surrounds these really nasty cancer cells that are there to take things over.
Exactly. And so hopefully that will enable some of the current drugs that are already approved to have a wider patient population that they're effective in.
Yeah, and I would think that would make them even more effective than they are.
Yeah.
Now, I know that 2048 also runs this biotech studio. Are any of those companies involved in that, or is that completely separate effort?
So none of the companies in the UK that I visited are in the biotech studio. So the biotech studio is an investment vehicle that we use for day zero companies to really help them accelerate their growth before finishing the pre-seed fundraise. We've had a number of really strong teams come through. Right now, I'm working with another one that's also in the tumor extracellular matrix environment, but on the other side. So this is an interesting company called Curagen. Is it okay if I highlight them as well?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Super. So they are developing a CAR T, that's cell therapy using T cells that are edited so that they will ignore the immunosuppressive signals that come from the tumor, because tumors, as they mutate, they start to send out a number of different types of soluble signals. Some of them are attached to the tumor cells themselves. And the thesis behind Curagen is that they can edit the T cells to basically be deaf to those cell signals. And so they can have greater efficacy, especially against the solid tumors where the CAR T therapies have just not been very successful.
Yeah, it's so complicated. I mean, it's no surprise that cancer therapeutics is the number one funded area of research and also for therapeutics. But cancer is just a tremendously interesting disease state. Cancer cells just take over the body. I mean, we all have cancer all the time, is what they say, but we're lucky that typically our immune system is fighting those cancers off. But it's just when things go awry, that's when you actually start to get the manifestation of cancer. But what other kinds of companies are in the studio in that investment vehicle? That runs on a cohort basis, right?
No, there's no cohort basis. That's a great question. So it's not a typical accelerator in terms of working alongside others who are at that same stage. It's an investment vehicle that I like to say has an accelerated path to investment. So we have a very prescribed kind of route by which we will do our diligence so that we can quickly get cash in the bank if it's a fit. And we have a number of companies that are in this space, but it is not something that they work alongside others. What you do get, I would say, is perhaps a little bit more time with the 2048 Ventures team. We're able to introduce folks from our network in order to help them determine the go-to-market, understand the true value prop is from customer calls, interpret what those customer discovery calls truly mean and what that first product perhaps should be. But it's not cohort-based. So that's a great question. We do a call for companies, but it's open year round. People can apply to it at the studio at any time if they have an idea and are interested in that check and that experience.
Yeah, I feel like I've seen you on your LinkedIn. You've probably mentioned it a few times. So I think that's why it's not clear to me when it happens. And it just sounds like it's rolling. And if it's the right fit for the company, then they can apply and work with you guys. And it sounds like a fantastic program.
It's really great. And we do promote it, particularly this time of year. There's a number of pitch competitions. We know that folks are just starting to think about if they're in the Nucleate program, do they want to take that to the next step? So it's a great time to start thinking about if you're ready to take that step into entrepreneurship, go full time. We can provide that first check and a little bit of support as well.
And have you guys done, I mean, I'm going to just be transparent. This is going to lead into our interview today. But have you done any work in animal health or looking at animal health? Just curious if that's part of the portfolio.
We have not done anything in animal health, but we do think that there is a great opportunity to, number one, our pet friends and our pet family members and improve the therapeutics and diagnostics for these canine and feline friends. But also it's a great way to, let's say, de-risk a technology that could then potentially be translated into humans. And so we have not actually done any investments here. We've spoken with a couple of folks who are interested in better pet diagnostics. I think it's a great space, but none in our portfolio yet.
Yeah, so here's a couple of things on that. Number one is you're absolutely right. Animal health is a great way to de-risk something that might actually end up going into humans. And an example of a company that maybe, we could say, I don't know, is parallel to or copied a model for human health and translated it to animal health is BasePaws. Do you know this company, Julie?
Oh, yeah, I've heard of BasePaws. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so BasePaws is basically a 23andMe for cats. At this point, they're probably like 8 or 10 years old, and they got purchased by Zoetis, a huge animal health company. I think the exit was something like $90 million, but they were basically doing genetic tests on cats, really helping owners understand the origin of their cats and helping owners also understand genetically some of the risks that a particular breed might have. I think that was something that was probably very attractive to a big animal health company like Zoetis. We've also had Biome Edit on the podcast. They talk about the microbiome of large animals and how being able to keep cows, horses, livestock healthier by managing their microbiomes. So I think there's a lot to be explored in that space.
Agreed.
So I think with that, what I'll do is I'll lead us into the interview today. Today's interview is with Joe Landolina of Cresilon, which is a Brooklyn-based medical device company, is the way I should put it. They started in a dorm room. The founders come out of NYU. They actually have the only sterile biomanufacturing in the 5 boroughs of New York. and they've got a product line that's available in 30 countries. You said you don't know them, right, Julie?
I have not met them, and I am kind of disappointed because I am also in Brooklyn. So you would think that our paths would have crossed, but no, I have not met them.
Yeah, so Joe mentions that he works in Gowanus, but we know they have a facility or a lab in Industry City as well.
Industry City has got a lot of really great folks. It's really starting to become a pretty strong biotech hub.
Yeah, it's pretty great. All right, well, let's let Joe take it away, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more.
Sounds great.
Hi, a quick shout out to our sponsor, Messaging Lab, the force multiplier for biotech. Your biotech company is making the world a better place. You know that, we know that. But does the world? There's a big reason why some biotech companies attract investors, sign up customers, and get attention. That reason is strategic communications. At Messaging Lab, we translate complex science and economics into compelling narratives. And we have done that for the most successful biotech companies across healthcare, agriculture, personal care and beauty, materials, and the list goes on. We're here to make sure your ideas not only get heard, but resonate with your audience. So if it's time to amplify your company's voice, visit messaginglab.com to explore how we can elevate your story and grow your business.
All right, Joe Landolina, Cresilon. I'm a huge fan, have been a huge fan for a long time. I feel like you're Brooklyn Biotech OG. So it's really a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Welcome to Grow Everything.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me on.
We want to get into Cresilon and exactly what Cresilon does, which is fascinating. But give us some background in terms of you, your career, how'd you get started? Give us the Joe Landolina story.
Yeah, of course. I had a bit of an unorthodox start into the world of biotech in that I grew up on a vineyard. My grandfather was an ex-Hoffman LaRoche executive who ended up starting a winery. He learned lab safety in the 60s. And for him, that meant tossing me into a lab the day that I learned how to walk and telling me that the best way to learn how to do chemistry is to just mix some things together and hopefully not get hurt. So that led me on a path that by the time that I was 17 years old, I was doing a lot of tissue engineering style research, and I ended up coming across the precursor to Vetigel. And so I'm an engineer by training. I did my undergrad and my graduate work at NYU Engineering. But when I was a freshman at NYU, I started Cresilon. And so now 14 years in, we've taken the company from what was a dorm room idea to today, what is now the only sterile biomanufacturing in the 5 boroughs of New York, with a product line that's commercial in 30 countries around the world.
That's amazing. You started it as a freshman. How did that happen?
Frankly speaking, my intention was not to start a biotech company. I didn't think it was possible or even reasonable. So with that, my intention was to get into medical school. I always wanted to be a surgeon, and my journey through engineering school was really just a way to do something different than the typical pre-med program. So I had this idea, and I didn't know if it would work, but I knew it was interesting. And when I got to NYU as a freshman, I saw that they had business plan competitions, both at Stern for the whole university and Innovation, which was just what's now Tandon at the engineering school. And I entered into both. I found my co-founder, Isaac Miller, who was a student at the business school at the time. And we ended up taking first place at the engineering school. We took second place in the whole university competition. And that gave us just enough capital to start prototyping and building. And really through that, we realized that not only was the problem that we were solving, bleeding, something that was massive and underserved, but that we really had something that could be different and could have a much better outcome than what was already out there on the market. And so we sort of felt that sense of responsibility to keep going and keep growing. And luckily, a few years ago, my parents stopped asking me if I was going to go get a real job somewhere.
That's hilarious. But I'm actually really interested in how did you get inspired to focus on wound care? You talked about your product we'll get into called Vetigel, but what was that aha moment? What were you doing? Were you in the lab? Were you walking on the street and saw something happen? What was that moment?
So as a kid, I used to set up crazy experiments. And what I was trying to do was differentiate stem cells in a winery lab. And as you can imagine, it didn't work. It didn't come close to working. But what I was trying to do was build a cell scaffold out of algae I was really bad at extractions and because no one would sell me actual cell scaffolding material. And so I was limited to what I could go out and find in nature or convince companies to give me as a free sample. So I ended up making this material that was a product of a really messy extraction that created a very viscous gel. So it sort of the color and material properties of hummus, but it would stick to skin and it wouldn't let go until you wanted it to. I had this idea, which was, what if you could take that and fill a bullet wound with it, at least long enough to stop that bleeding so you can get that patient to the next level of care? I wasn't thinking about what it would do afterwards. I wasn't expecting the product to be able to do anything beyond that. But the original idea was just think about something that's an organic liquid bandage that can work on really big things temporarily. And obviously now Vetigel has been used in everything from neurosurgery in dogs to gunshot wounds and everything in between. So the product has far wider applications than that. But at least in the beginning, it was just point of care use to get the patient to the next level of care.
How did you make the leap from this thing sticks to your skin to, hey, this could be useful for a wound?
So it happened slowly and over time. So we entered this into the business plan competition when it was effectively just a concept. And then from there, we started testing, we started developing, we started realizing that not only was it plugging the wound, but it was allowing the patient to create a strong, durable clot or a fibrin patch underneath without becoming incorporated within that clot. So what I mean by that is if we've ever cut ourselves shaving, you put toilet paper on it. You then pull the toilet paper off and you have toilet paper and a clot in your hand and a scratch that's still bleeding. So the reason for that is that the clot ends up wrapped around the fibers of that toilet paper. The biggest innovation with this gel is that it allows itself to stay in place despite even brisk or high pressure bleeds like a massive arterial bleed. But when it creates the clot for the patient, or when the patient creates their own clot, if you peel the gel away, the clot stays behind. And so it allows you to take a process that would have taken 5 to 7 minutes and compress it down into just a handful of seconds.
Wow. After you created Vetigel, the first market was the veterinary market. We'd love to learn more about your thoughts on why you started in the veterinary market and what was that first experience where you saw Vetigel work? How did you see it in action?
Yeah, of course. Vetigel is a great story, and maybe I'm a little bit biased, but it actually started with Hurricane Sandy. I'm a New Yorker. So in 2012, we were 2 years into the founding of the business. At that time, our first market was trauma care, which is a market that we're prepping to enter as we speak now. But we realized very rightly so that it was going to be very difficult and probably impossible for a group of teenagers to raise enough funding to enter the trauma market because that's a massive place to go first. In 2012, an employee of mine was also working in the animal care field and realized that after Hurricane Sandy, there were a number of animals in zoos that died, not because of lack of care, but because there was no product that could stop bleeding that was caused by storm damage. And so he brought this to me and said, Joe, while we're working on this human product, there's a massive opportunity in animal health and we should check it out. And so we didn't have a lot of funding at the time. A decent percentage of the funding that we had on hand are prize winnings from these competitions, because this is before we even raised our first round of investment. And we flew out to San Diego to go to the American Veterinary Medical Association conference in 2012. We ended up talking to 350 potential customers, veterinarians, and every single one of them told us that they had really nothing that worked well in that space, and that if we could bring a product to market, they would love to use it. And so at that time, we pivoted and we realized that the animal health market is an opportunity to enter a field that has limited competition, where there are more surgeries done in pets every year than there are in humans. And so this is a massive market, but a market that's underserved or that tends to be an afterthought by big pharma just after they've already entered these spaces. And so we realized that there was an opportunity for us to launch there, to develop with end users, to make sure that we were truly finding product market fit, and to use the product across a broad range of indications. It ended up taking us quite a bit longer than we thought. It turns out that this product is so difficult to manufacture that we couldn't use a contract manufacturer to do it. So Cresilon had to either shut down or raise enough investment to build our own manufacturing. Between the years of 2014 and 2020, we spent our time not only perfecting the product, but also building state-of-the-art manufacturing. And so we're the only sterile fill and finish operation in the 5 boroughs of New York, which is something that we're very proud of. When we launched in 2020, we launched first in the dental market. One thing that you don't think about is that if you have a pet, that pet has to be under full general anesthesia while dental extractions or even dental cleanings are happening. And if there's a bleed in that surgery, you can't tell Fido to go home and chew on gauze for 6 hours to get it to stop. So you have to keep that pet under anesthesia while you're putting pressure on that bleed. And so you're paying OR costs, you're paying the team and overhead to keep that dog on the table. And that dog is putting itself under additional risk by being under anesthesia. So just by using our product, you can shave 30% of the OR time off of every single procedure on average. So that's a massive cost savings. There's a massive improvement in outcomes for those patients. But what I'll say is that the types of procedures that I've seen have just blown me away. I remember we had a case as we were launching in the UK. We trained the clinic. The day after we trained this clinic, it was in the first week of launch over there. There was a dog that was hit by a car, and the dog ended up having a lacerated IVC, vena cava. This is a massive blood vessel, the second largest blood vessel in the body, and usually it's end game. And with a 5 milliliter Vetigel syringe, we're able to stop that bleed on contact, and the dog was able to go home shortly thereafter. So really, really amazing outcomes that we've seen. I've seen the product used in spine surgery where you can effectively have the time that the patient is on the table and allow the patients to move into recovery far faster. I mean, now we're doing a collaboration with Walter Reed, looking not only at hemostasis, but also after a gunshot wound to the brain, can you use our product to effectively hold the brain in place so that you can get that patient to the next level of care? And preliminary results look incredibly positive there. And the potential applications here are widespread. And the great thing about animal health is that when you put the product into the hands of end users, because it's a general indication hemostatic, they're going to use it anywhere and everywhere. You just get such an overwhelmingly positive amount of feedback that comes off of the market that helps us develop and helps us move our strategy forward, especially as we start gearing up for human use.
Yeah, I think that there's so much to unpack with what you just said, Joe. I'm so inspired and amazed by this story. I love hearing when someone goes into the animal health market because it is, as you say, underserved. And it is a place where really anybody that has a product that they're thinking of using in humans can go into and probably a lot faster. They have the kind of success that you guys have had. But you said that this product was born out of an experiment gone wrong.
Exactly.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. And that you also said that a couple of teenagers weren't going to be able to get the funding for this, which is also like an amazing part of this story, because you don't really hear that on the biotech side. You hear it in the app side or flipping sneaker side where teenagers build these massive businesses. But I don't think we've heard of any on the biotech side yet.
Yeah, I think I was technically 20 when we raised our A round.
Still a teenager.
Just on the cusp.
I'm curious, what was that experiment that failed? I mean, what was that experiment you were trying to achieve that then all of a sudden it became the Vetigel?
So I was trying to make a scaffold to inject stem cells into. It didn't work for a number of reasons. I was trying to jury rig a lot of things, and I was operating primarily off of free samples and things found in nature. And those don't tend to cooperate in experiments that require higher finesse, like cell culture.
And what was your thinking in terms of injecting the stem cells into it? What was it for?
Oh, I was just fascinated by it. I'd had some exposure. I did a summer research program for high school students at Columbia University the summer before, maybe 2 summers prior to that. And so it was just such a cool concept that I just wanted to see what I could do. So I remember I ended up getting some free samples of T50 cell culture flasks, and we set up a small hood in the winery lab and just started messing around. There was no rigor to it. I always describe myself as more of a cook than a baker. I have a decent chemical intuition, but I'm not one to follow a recipe or write a recipe. So for that, I have many smarter scientists and engineers than myself.
Amazing. And Vetigel is basically a plant-based polymer, but it also was born of this failed experiment. How was it that you decided to use a non-animal source to create this? You said you were doing it to create a scaffold. And then when you talk about where the product is now, what does having a non-animal source mean for biocompatibility?
So again, it's sort of a funny childhood story in that my parents were not thrilled that I had free rein on a lab. And so they didn't like, quote, chemicals. But if it came from nature, then in their opinion, it was safer. I had far more ability to go and get things. Little did they know that it's just as dangerous, as maybe not more, the type of stuff that you can get from nature. But that being said, I became really good at plant-based chemistry because also it was easy to purchase raw materials through molecular gastronomy and other food grade materials. So that became a really good source for young scientists working on things because nothing was controlled, nothing was difficult to get to. Now, on the flip side, what that translates to is that our materials are grass. generally recognized as safe by the FDA, which means that these are materials that have well understood toxicologies. They have well understood biocompatibility profiles. A lot of the risks that come along with using animal-derived materials aren't there with plant-based materials. And that doesn't mean that all plant-based materials are entirely safe, of course, but at least the materials that we have, and we're not the first people to implant these materials into patients. It's just the way that we treat them, the way that we mix them together that gives us the desired effect.
Yeah, I love the fact that you were leaning on your parents for some direction on what to use. I think it's great. I mean, you were younger, but besides them being partners, can you discuss any strategic partnerships or collaborations you've formed with other organizations to further any R&D initiatives that you have?
Sure. So Walter Reed is a major partnership of ours, and
Amazing.
that's an absolutely fascinating area. So they're focused on a subset of traumatic brain injury called PBBIs, which is penetrating ballistic like brain injury. So that's looking at the after effects of whether it's a gunshot wound to the brain or a shrapnel injury where the patient is still alive but needs stabilization or what we call neuroprotection. They came to us and they saw what we were doing in the field of hemostasis, and they had this idea, which is what if you took this material and yes, there's some bleeding in these types of wounds, but really the primary issue is making sure that we do no harm and making a material that can interact with the brain without making any major changes to vitals or sustaining the patient over a period of time. And so we've begun that research project, and preliminary results have come back, and I can't go into too much detail. It's being presented at a major conference sometime later this year, but it looks incredibly promising to see what we're seeing here.
What has it been like to go from animal to human? It sounds like you guys have almost 10 years of experience with your product in animals, but making that transition from animals to human seems like it'd be very complicated. Give us a picture of what that looks like.
So it definitely does. And one of my favorite jokes that I hear is, what do you call a veterinarian that only operates on one species? A doctor.
Yeah. Yeah.
Our business is not limited just to companion animals. We have a massive exotics practice. And so everything from whales, dolphins, lions, chimpanzees, you name it, exotic birds that I learned of the day after we had product used in one of them. You get this wide breadth. As an engineer, I love trial by fire testing of products. The benefit of the Vetigel launcher, beyond the patient benefit, is that if you ask me, will it work in a gunshot wound? I can tell you, yes. In fact, unfortunately, we had 2 gunshot wounds in dogs relatively recently, just around the corner from our offices here in Brooklyn, that our product was used on and was used successfully in those cases. There's a stab injury that also happened around the corner here in Brooklyn. And maybe this isn't the best commercial for Brooklyn, or at least Brooklyn for dogs, but you can establish that use case. Now, beyond that, we also in the very beginning took the strategy that even though regulation is lower in the animal health side of the business, it's my rule that I tell my team is that I like to sleep at night. So we're not going to cut corners anywhere. So when we built our facilities, when we set up our quality systems, we did so with a human level of quality in mind. The jump actually isn't as difficult as it would have been if we cut corners on Vetigel, but we decided to make Vetigel to a human standard. While there are additional validations, additional quality systems that need to be added, and additional testing in order to support our FDA approvals or clearances, the systems, the technology that we have was based in that level of rigor to begin with. So it's not a massive shift. We've been operating GMP since the beginning of our launch with Vetigel. There's not that much of a change.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but do you have to get regulatory approval for, is it every kind of wound? What kind of bleeding is it? Is it a brain injury? Is it a laceration? Do you have to have use cases for each of those to get your approval on them?
In the human space, that's closer to correct than not. So it's not as targeted as it could be, but it's limited by location of bleed and by severity of bleed. So locations are either external use or internal, and then there's minor or moderate to severe. We've been working our way along that spectrum. We last year received FDA clearance on external minor use. So that's minor lacerations, things like minor types of bleeds that'll present themselves to a doctor. Where we're going from this is up to major bleeds. Think gunshot wounds, major trauma on the belt of U.S. military soldiers, on ambulances, and in trauma hospitals. So that's something that we're rapidly working towards product launch on.
Okay, so right now you've been primarily selling to veterinary hospitals and clinics, and then you're going to go into the military or other hospitals or trauma care units, and primarily focus in the U.S. or is it global? Like, tell us a little bit more about how much market penetration you've had.
So Vetigel is global. Vetigel is available in about 30 countries today. We've saved the lives of over 50,000 patients around the world, primarily companion animals, so dogs and cats. So that's something that I talk about this a lot, but I tend to eschew vanity metrics like headcount and valuation and the amount of capital raised, lives saved or lives impacted, depending on use case. That's the KPI that we lead with. It's great to be able to see that widespread use on the Vetigel product line. Now, there's obviously still some growth to go and some exciting expansion that's coming in the animal health market. On the human side, what we're looking forward to is our first life saved in a human. That's approaching rapidly.
Consumers purchase it, or is it just B2B right now?
It's just B2B. Vetigel is a prescription-only product. It's designed for surgical use.
As you guys expand globally, tell us about how regulatory is different in different places. Is it the same for all animal? Like if it's an animal product used in the US, you can use it anywhere. Regulatory is different on the human side.
It varies country by country. What I'll say is that in most places, animal medical devices, sort of called veterinary devices, sit in a regulatory gray space. The way that we as Cresilon interpret that regulatory gray space is we apply human medical device quality systems into that space. But depending on country, there are varying regulations. Again, in the spirit of sleeping at night, we apply the human systems to it. And then if there's anything above and beyond that that's required, and usually it's on import restrictions and not from a regulatory perspective, but we ensure that we're in compliance with local laws and registrations as well.
That's so cool.
Yeah. I'm really interested in terms of product development. Can you discuss any R&D efforts to further enhance Vetigel? Is there anything that you're looking at that's new in terms of technologies or making it more optimal for wound care, or is it perfect?
So nothing is perfect. And I'm also a big believer that a one product company isn't quite a company. In order for Cresilon to thrive in the future, it's going to be predicated, even if we have the best product in the world, you need diversity. You need a product pipeline that's there. We have a very active R&D team that in the near term, we're constantly working to improve Vetigel and the technology behind it. We're working with surgeons every single day. I always joke that I get itchy if I don't spend time in the OR with our surgeons. We need to see it get used. We need to see where it's working, where it's not working, where we can improve so we can constantly be giving the best product out to the market. And we've been doing a lot of development, not only in the gel itself, but also in delivery systems and making sure that we can optimize the way that the product gets delivered to the wound in a way that allows the surgeon to do what they do better. And then beyond that, we're also looking at more forward-facing things, whether that happens by internal development or by acquisition. We have a team that's constantly looking at opportunities there.
Well, and I think that's really good. We want to know, what's your long-term plan? I think of Ethicon as being the biggest surgical tools company. They're a division of Johnson & Johnson, I believe. What's the long-term goal for Cresilon?
What I'll say is that the strategy here is maintaining optionality. So in my opinion, growing Cresilon as if we're going to become our own massive company is not the worst strategy in the world. It means that we're focusing on fundamentals. We're making products that save lives, and we're making products that solve the need of our customers. And we're growing a business that can deliver that consistently at a level of quality that the customer deserves, the patient deserves. Realistically, 90% of biotechs, at least the ones that succeed, end in something in M&A of some sort. We're not deluded into thinking that it's very likely we'll be entirely in control as we go forward. But again, in my opinion, we're not building a widget. We're building a fully fledged company. We've been a highly verticalized business, and we've invested heavily in our supply chain. We've invested heavily in in-house manufacturing, and we own our own sales force because, again, in my opinion, the best champion of your product is a W-2 of your company. It's not a distributor rep. We work very closely with our distributor partners, but we do so by having sales reps on the ground that can support their teams.
You mentioned vertically focusing on wound care. And again, I know that since you're CEO, you have to be very careful of what you say about the future and the vision. But let's just speculate, and maybe there's an alternate universe about horizontally. Do you see in terms of helping? Is it helping in surgery or other aspects of healthcare? Is it continuing to make products for wound care, for just external? Do you think of drug development? Especially because you're with these OR doctors and you're there and you're seeing different things. You're like, oh, wait, that could be, you're an entrepreneur. You're thinking of all these problems. You're like, that could be solved. I know I'm working on Vetigel, but maybe I'll get to that in the future.
I can't go into a huge amount of detail, but what I will say is that our strategy here is to focus on Cresilon's areas of excellence. We know biomaterials really well. We know how to make materials that just work at the end of the day. And that's not only applicable into hemostasis. We're also really good at complicated manufacturing that most other people would be crazy to touch. We built it here in Brooklyn, which maybe is crazy in its own right. In the confluence of that, there's a landscape for more technology. So it's very likely horizontal. But the biggest caveat is that what I'm not interested in personally are products that will be 5 or 10% better than competition. If we're going to invest in something, it has to truly deliver a solution that solves a patient need in a way that's 1 or 2 orders of magnitude differentiated from what exists in the market.
You said maybe it's crazy to have built it in Brooklyn. You're a New Yorker. Why? Why did you choose to build in Brooklyn?
So put frankly, and hopefully I don't offend anyone, but I live in Brooklyn. I didn't want to commute to Jersey. We enjoyed building it around here. In the very beginning, I needed a site. If my background looks a little bit weird, this is an old 1930s schoolhouse that we found on Craigslist in 2013. And this is 2 subway stops away from NYU's engineering campus because at the time, all of my employees were NYU students. We built our first labs here in Brooklyn. We loved it. We decided to stay, and we just couldn't see ourselves anywhere else. It's not without its challenges. It's definitely difficult to do this in New York, but Pfizer was founded here. BMS was founded here. And Pfizer's manufacturing, when it shut down in the early 2000s, was on Flushing Avenue in Brooklyn. There's a history of building that manufacturing. And interestingly enough, after Pfizer shut down, and there were employees that worked at that site that were taking other jobs until we opened up our manufacturing. And now we have at least 1 technician that worked at the original Pfizer site that was doing something different other than biomanufacturing until the day that we opened. It's really nice as a native New Yorker to see these types of jobs and see this type of production come back. And selfishly, it's nice to walk to work.
Yeah, no, amazing. NYU Engineering Campus is downtown Brooklyn, right?
Exactly.
And so 2 subway stops from there. I mean, where is this schoolhouse that you're at?
We're in Gowanus or Park Slope.
Okay. Oh, yeah. So that's where I live. Erum lives on the other side of the park. Our office is in Dumbo. So it's the same kind of thing. It's like 20-minute bike ride, or if I really want to walk, it's 40 minutes.
Exactly.
But there's nothing like having that option.
Exactly.
And it seems like New York's doing a lot to help incentivize biotech companies to come here. And I saw on LinkedIn recently you joined Mayor Eric Adams for signing a new biotech credit bill. What does that bill offer biotech entrepreneurs? And can you share more about why NYC is a good place to start a biotech or move their biotech here?
I'm very bullish on New York. Right? I think one of the challenges that we have here in New York is that the infrastructure for manufacturing is difficult. If you want to do manufacturing, you're retrofitting a building that's been around for a while. When we look at what Boston did with Cambridge, they built that from the ground up. It was effectively greenfield. It was greenfield construction, which allowed them to build state-of-the-art biotech in an easier way. In New York, we have New York landlords that by and large want biotech in principle, but don't realize that it takes a lot of effort in order to do that. So we've been lucky that we found really great partners been able to work with. We have an excellent landlord by way of Industry City. In the city, both Mayor Adams and NYC EDC seem to be well incentivized to try to bring biotechs here into New York. It's going to take time. It's nice that Cresilon is now the only manufacturer here. I used to say that our internships would get 800 applicants each. We just hit a record. We had 3,100 applicants into each of our 8 internship slots.
Amazing.
For this summer. There's a lot of interest in working in biotech in New York, and it's great to see that ecosystem booming. And then talk a little bit about the tax credit. The tax credit was a way for biotechs to be able to redeem the investment that we make in R&D here by hiring scientists to do research in New York City. And that original tax credit was capped at, I believe, 5 years. The entire tax credit expired several years ago. This was a renewal, so it not only brings that tax credit back so other companies can avail it, but it also allows those of us who have stayed here for longer than 5 years to be able to continue to see the benefit of investing in R&D here and not offshoring it or moving it outside of NYC.
That's amazing. I know you've been Forbes 30 under 30, which is well-deserved. But what kind of advice do you give to aspiring entrepreneurs? I mean, you started as a teenager. You said you were 20, but still, this thing was born in a dorm room. It's an amazing story.
My biggest piece of advice for aspiring entrepreneurs is you have to make sure that you're truly, truly passionate about the problem that you're solving. I see too many entrepreneurs who want to start a company for the sake of starting a company. And what I'll say is that maybe not everyone, it'll take them 14 years to do this, but there are a lot of ups and downs in those 14 years. If we look at T0 and today, it seems like it was all up and to the right, but instead it was very much a roller coaster. One of the best pieces of advice that I got when I was starting out was close your eyes, imagine yourself at your retirement party. Can you imagine yourself retiring from this business? And if so, then this is the business for you. And at the time, I actually didn't want to submit this idea to the business plan competition because I thought it was too difficult and no one would believe that we could start a biotech company. And so I had a few other things I just wanted to throw into the competition. And this steeled my resolve and made me realize, you know what? This is something that I want to do. I'm passionate about it. And at the end of the day, we save lives. So that gets me out of bed every single day. And being able to say that we can do that means that no matter what's happening, whether good or bad, you can get up and get into the office and do what needs to be done. It has to come from passion.
Awesome. Yeah, I always put a lot of our guests in the hot seat by thinking like away from their company. And I'm really sorry to ask this question. You don't have to answer it, but I think you should, because if you were given an option to start another company, again, based on some of the experience or just a different passion that you might have, although we know your passion's wound care and it's Vetigel and it's Cresilon, what other company would you start if you could? You are entrepreneurial, you see things. I'm always curious to see what would a parallel world look like for Joe Landolina?
So it's a difficult question. For better or for worse, if the question was, what is your dream job? It's this one. I know I'm very lucky in that. The engineer in me gets to solve a different problem every day. They may not be fun problems to solve, but at least they're different. If I wasn't doing this, I love the animal health space. It's such a fascinating space that is, again, underserved by companies. Whether we talk about biosurgery and how they're really beyond Cresilon, there are very few, if any, biosurgical companies that are playing in that space. But even the way that you get products to customers in that space has a lot to be desired. That interests me deeply. And who knows what chapter 2 will look like, or even maybe if that's the space that we go into as Cresilon. But it's something that I find fascinating.
Well, and that makes me wonder, well, what kind of pets do you have?
I have an 85-pound German Shepherd.
Oh my God.
In Brooklyn Heights.
Oh my
Amazing.
gosh. Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Joe, was there anything that we should have asked you that we didn't?
No, I think we covered it. I've loved all these questions. I really like the last few that went through New York and what comes next.
Here we are. We joke around about having a Brooklyn biotech mafia. A lot of it is aspiring entrepreneurs and then people who are working at companies as well. You're definitely a member since you live right here, probably a couple blocks from where we're both sitting. So that's amazing. It's really been such a pleasure to have you and do this interview and to finally meet you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me on and then spending time with me this morning.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, we'll definitely invite you to one of our Brooklyn Biotech Mafia hangouts.
Please do.
So you'll be the healthcare, wound care chieftain.
Yeah, and luckily you'd be in Brooklyn Heights. We always do it in downtown Brooklyn.
Easy enough. I walk through that every day. I walk from Brooklyn Heights down to Gowanus. And once we're actually moving down to Industry City with the bulk of our operations. So it'll be a little bit longer walk, but still doable.
Awesome.
I'm always there. I'm always in Industry City. If you guys do tours, we would love to come and do a tour.
Yeah, let me know. We love giving tours.
Awesome. All right, Joe, that's it. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you. We will contact you, of course, to get maybe a drink at Industry City, get a tour. It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Awesome. And likewise. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. So here's something interesting from the interview, Julie. I remember I'd seen Joe and his team at an NYU business competition, probably like 2013, 2014, feels like a really long time ago. But he said that after Hurricane Sandy, which was devastating for New York City, many animals died in zoos and on the streets, I guess, because they didn't have a product to stop bleeding. That's how they saw the application of going into animals first. One of the things that stands out in the interview is, like we said at the beginning, going into animal is potentially an easier path than if you want to go straight into human.
Yes, we've seen that in a number of spaces, not only what Joe and Cresilon are doing, but you can look at Loyal, which is in the longevity space, where they're looking at some of the things that will extend life in some of our canine companions with the eventual goal of translating that into humans to increase both quality and quantity of human life. Loyal just raised $45 million with a Series B, and I believe they are working largely with dogs in order to understand longevity in dogs.
Did you happen to see this news a couple of years ago that the average age of a cat has increased? I think that cats typically used to only live to like, say, 7 or 8 years when they were out in the wild. But because they've been domesticated, they live up to 20 years or more.
I have not seen that, but I hope it's true. I have 2 cats, and I hope they live to be 20 years old. No, that's really interesting.
I know. I think about it too, because I think Anya is maybe like 7 or going on 8. She still feels pretty young to me, but I'm measuring it in human years, not cat years.
Yeah, absolutely. Loyal is developing drugs for senior dogs, so very much in that space to help folks prolong the time that they have with their pets.
Yeah, it's amazing. The amount of money, I don't know what the number is off the top of my head, but I find it super interesting. And I think it's super interesting that it's where Cresilon landed, and that's where they're really developing things. And now looking to get into humans because they've done a lot of proof points in all sorts of animals. I think he said they have a wall of pictures that shows all the animals the Cresilon product has been used in.
These are very difficult clinical trials in humans as well. Anything that has to do with bleeding, because often it involves a traumatic event or is a very sudden acute event. And so it can be difficult to get folks to opt in for a clinical trial, given kind of the nature of that. So showing proof of principle in animals will help, I think, accelerate that timeline in humans, because not that you bypass the clinical trial, of course, but you help to demonstrate that there is this very strong proof of concept in animals.
Yeah. Julie, when we had talked about you coming on and co-hosting, which I'm so glad you did, I asked you if there's anything else you wanted to talk about, and you wrote down AI and Biobanks. I'm curious about both of those things.
Oh, sure. So we'll start with Biobanks. So we are a thesis-driven firm. Let me start with that. And we bat ideas around internally. We try to form coherent thoughts around where the world is going and what types of technologies we think are important to see in the future. One area we've been talking about is biobanks. It's tied a little bit into the AI piece, but I'll start with the biobanks because this is a very siloed industry. There are biobanks associated with most major universities. There are some nonprofit biobanks as well, but these are not particularly well funded or cared for institutions. However, they have very valuable data in terms of the patient samples, which unfortunately are often not very well categorized, don't have a lot of data behind them. We feel like there's a really strong opportunity to build a startup that would allow not just better, let's say, indexing, although I think that would be part of the value proposition, indexing of these samples, but really turning this into something that would allow value to be created from what we already have, rather than having to necessarily run a prospective clinical trial to see if something works. You could gather a bunch of samples from some prospective biobanks, do a little bit of retrospective analysis on this to see if your idea is worthwhile. There's a number of different aspects to where we think there's some value here. I can send you our thesis. We published this a couple months ago, just around where we think the future is going. There's definitely a software play. However, getting additional information, going through some of these samples, making sure that all of the relevant data, de-identified data, I should mention, is also associated with the proper sample, I think would be valuable on both ends for the biobanks and then for others who might want to access some of these samples in order to move their technology forward.
Yeah, I don't remember if you shared it already. I'd love to see it because a couple of things come to mind. Actually, a bunch of things, but I'll go through them quickly. One is you need to talk to Andrew Hessel if you haven't talked to him, because Andrew is really big on biobanks, especially when it comes to people banking their own, cells or whatever. The other thing, too, is you bring up something really interesting because when we had done work with Cultivating, one of the things that we talked a lot about is that professors will spend their entire career developing and studying a particular organism, but then when they retire, all that knowledge gets lost. And so that probably means all the samples also get lost. So universities do have a lot of knowledge, and I think pharma does too. You have all these samples that are stored. You might not even know what they are. I could see a franchise type of model emerging. You have these biobanks that are maybe around university centers that are collecting and, like you say, de-identifying the human samples so they can be used for testing. You're going to talk about AI, but there's also a blockchain component to this. And then, I don't know if you saw this, but there was in the news just recently a female egg banking company that had a business model where it was like, we will store your eggs for free, but we want multiple eggs and we will sell some of those eggs. And I think they got into some hot water. We talked a little bit about it in our last podcast with Laura Minkini of Athena. I don't really know the details of it, but I do think that there's a huge opportunity there. I just think there is so much knowledge that we already have, and we just haven't even tapped into it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. I will have to go back. I'm a little bit behind on some of the prior episodes. I most recently listened to the one on networking, though. I thought that was really valuable information, especially with SynBio beta coming up, which I hope we're going to talk about as well.
Yeah. And you also had written down AI and bio. So what's your thinking there?
Well, we've been thinking about AI in general, just because it is becoming a part of a lot of different value propositions across verticals. And it's something that we want to invest in, but we don't want to be reactionary. We want to think about where there's true value to be created. This is another thesis that we've recently published, looking at how we expect AI to create value just across the board going forward. But this applies certainly to bio. So one of the areas that we are bullish on is the ability to have a unique data capture through existing workflow. So what does that mean? For example, we are investors in a company called Persist AI. They are speeding up the formulation process for different drug companies. And the way that they do this is they have lab automation set up. They do thousands of different formulations, and then they will start to layer on the AI compute level in order to better, number one, sift through all of those different formulations, and number two, speed up the design process so it becomes iterative, but it's all based on their own data. And I think that this is the important thing here. They still own the data. They are creating very novel algorithms, but nobody else can create these algorithms because they have the data on which these are built. So I think when people are thinking about the ability to move faster in bio, I think absolutely. That is basically how we are using all of the compute power that people are putting into new products. But thinking about long-term moats, how do you create something that is also defensible? And that, let's say, if you're successful, not another startup will be able to create and eat away at some of your customers. That is where we start thinking about, okay, well, how are we able to get some proprietary data that perhaps will be value to the company in terms of the defensibility?
To me, that brings up so many interesting ideas because we're talking about all these samples, and all those samples potentially could have a lot of data attached to them. We work with this company, Epigene Labs, and one of the things they do is they harmonize old data so that you can reinterrogate it, because there is so much data out there, and they've got some interesting papers that are going to come out in the next couple of weeks that show the benefits of being able to do that. I think that we tend to get enamored with new data, thinking the new data is better. And I think that there's a world where we use the new and the old together, but you need to be able to have these AI tools that you're talking about that make it easier to do that. Persist sounds super interesting because I hadn't thought about formulation on the pharma side that way. One of the conversations I had with the K18 Hair, they formulate a lot of their products on computers before they even go into the lab. So that gives them a huge competitive advantage compared to other companies. It allows them to create things that are very unique. And I'd never heard of that being applied in the beauty space. So it would make sense that that's happening in pharma as well, or vice versa.
Yeah, the compute layer is generally something that I see as like accelerating the speed at which we're able to find the things that will eventually become the bioproducts, the K18s or the formulations.
Absolutely. So you said you're going to SynBio beta?
I am going to SynBio beta. I didn't go last year. Felt a little bit of FOMO because everyone talked about how great the conference was. And so I will be back. So will our analyst, Sandra, will join us. And we're very excited to arrive at, I think it's the beginning of May. So it should be a beautiful time in San Jose.
Yeah, it's May 6th. So I'm super excited to have you there. That'll be great. And I'm sure we'll talk between now and then and figure out who each of us wants to meet and see how we can help each other out. I'll just mention that anybody who's listening who uses the Grow Everything code could get a $300 discount. If you're going to pay to go to SynBio beta, it's something worthwhile. Julie, it's been so great to have you as a co-host. I hope you and I do this again soon. Was there anything else that you wanted to cover today?
All good. This was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Okay, well, I'm going to do it again. Thank you so much.